Good morning.
Good morning, Jerry.
I want you to know what an honor it is for me to stand in your presence. How many of you have not heard me speak before? Please raise your hand. Well, have fun. If I was talking to you one-on-one, the first thing I'd do is ask you, what books have you read? What trainings have you taken? What words and concepts do you use as you explore this idea of being God in form? And then we could do this whole thing based on the words you're familiar with, the concepts you're used to using. But since I'm up here and I'm going to take about 25 minutes, there's a good chance as I get on a roll this morning, I might say something a little different than you're used to. I might quote scripture or tell a story a little different. And all I would ask is if we run into a place where there's a little difference, please look past it, because I guarantee you my sole intention this morning is to remind each of us how absolutely magnificent and powerful we are right now. Now, with that being said, there's this many people who haven't heard me before. I tell a little of my story, how I got into this marvelous philosophy we call unity, what I call the practical application of the teachings of Jesus. When I was 22, I hurt my back. I was working construction between college semesters. A year later, I had a spinal fusion. During surgery, somehow my spine got infected with the E. coli bacteria. E. coli is a bad bug, and this was almost 50 years ago. It was worse then. And so my doctor, this orthopedic surgeon, said, look, the only way to get E. coli out is to go cut it out. So we're going to go in and cut out this infection. I said, okay. So he did 4 surgeries over the next year to cut out this infection. And every time he went in, it was worse. So finally, at the last one, he just sewed me up and said, look, this way out of my league. So I've taken the liberty of presenting your case to the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle. That's where I live. You couldn't get in there unless you had something really big. And they've accepted you. So I went in there and became a real celebrity. You know, it turned out I had the worst case of osteomyelitis of the spine, an infection of the bone I'd ever seen. So my doctor became this visiting professor from England. Kind of a standoffish guy. He was supposed to be the number 3 orthopedic surgeon in the whole world. The other professors didn't talk like that, but the interns and residents did. And I thought he was kind of arrogant. He said, look, with E. coli, there's not a good antibiotic, so I'm just going to find out where this is in your body, and I'm going to go cut it out. Okay. And he said, I don't want to be blindsided, so I'm going to do some tests. So they did tests for 2 weeks. All day, every day, for 2 weeks, they did tests. They poked me in places I didn't even know I had places. Anyway, he came in one afternoon with his resident and 3 or 4 interns, and when he came in that afternoon, he was different. He didn't seem so arrogant and standoffish, and he said, look, we've got great x-rays now. We know the extent of this infection, but it's more involved than I thought. So I'm going to have a meeting tomorrow with some other specialists, and after the meeting, we'll tell you what we're going to do, and then next day we'll do this cutting out procedure. And I said, okay. That afternoon, when my wife came, the first thing she said when she walked into my room was, what's going on? And I said, what do you mean? She said, the nurses wouldn't look at me. When I came in, they all turned around and got busy doing something else. What's going on? I said, I don't know. Next day, she came with our 2-year-old daughter, and we waited for this meeting, which started at 4 o'clock and went till, nobody showed up till 8:15. Door to my private room opened up, and in walked 6 surgeons. 6. And if it's good news, there's usually one person to tell you. There was this orthopedic guy from England. Behind him was the head of the Department of General Surgery. Behind him was head of the Department of Infectious Disease. Behind them were the 3 top residents in those departments. And this is what they said. This infection has spread. It's no longer just in your lower spine. It's throughout your spine. It's followed both of your sciatic nerves into your thighs. It's throughout your pelvic area. It's throughout your abdomen. And it's eating holes in the colon so the germs are communicating back and forth. And he said, if we don't stop this now, you will die. The doctors don't say it like that. What they say is, this has now become life-threatening. Which means, if we don't stop this now, you will die. And so he said, what we're going to do is, we have to go in and do the most extensive debridement we've ever attempted. We're going to take you down the operating theater, and first the general surgeons are going to start from the front. They're going to start as low as they can go down here in your pelvic area, come up around your belly button, and we're going to go almost up your sternum. We're going to open all of that up, cut out all the infected tissue, separate your organs out of the way, and when we get out of the spine, the orthopedic surgeons will chisel and scrape the infection out of your spine. When we're done with that, we're going to roll you over, and the orthopedic surgeons are going to take over. They're going to start as low as they can go down here between your buttocks. We're going to come up mid-back, open all that up, cut out all the infected tissue, chisel and scrape the infection out of your spine. He went into a lot more detail than I'm giving you, but that's the sort of the summary. He says, when we're done with that, 2 teams of surgeons are going to start at your belt line, open up both your buttocks, and when we're done with that, we're going to tip you up on the end and come in from the bottom. That one got my attention. When it was all done, he sat down on a chair, pulled it up next to my bed, and reached out and took my hand. And that's when I knew I was in trouble, because this guy was not a touchy-feely doctor. And he said, son, I know how radical this must seem, but we have to do this. We've got to stop this now. He said, we're pretty sure with the debridement and the antibiotics and the drains that we can stop this from spreading anymore. He said, the bad news is, we can guarantee you, you are going to lose the use of your left leg through nerve damage. And then he just sat there and looked at me. And I looked at him. And he looked at me. And finally, I figured it must be my turn to say something, and I heard come out of my own mouth, that's okay. That's okay. If we've got to do this, let's just get it over with. But even as I heard those words come out of my mouth, part of me, I thought, what has happened to me? What has happened that in just 1 year I would so willingly give up the use of my left leg? But I no sooner said that than he reached up with his other hand and clamped mine between his, and he said, son, we have to do this. The bad news is, if it's as extensive as we think it is, there's a good chance you're going to lose some of the mobility of your right leg. You're probably going to lose the control of your bowels and your bladder. And there's a very good chance you're going to end up sexually impotent. That was just before my 24th birthday. When they left, the resident who had been with me for the 2 weeks of tests stayed, and he sat on my bed with my wife, and on either side they just held me because I was just shaking. And when I finally calmed down, he said, Terry, we don't know what's going to happen. We've never seen anything like this. But what we do know is you cannot expect to come out of this one whole. The name of my book is The Hell I Can't. I invite you this morning to get underneath the words I use. Get underneath the concepts I share. Because when I talk to you about your absolute authority on this physical plane to make your dreams a reality, it isn't because I read a couple books or went to a couple workshops. I got to prove it to myself. This idea that all things are possible if only you believe. Next morning when they went in to open the pelvic area, they said, Lord, in my colon was like a sieve. They said there weren't any holes in it. It was just eaten up like a sieve. So they pulled my bowels out, clipped them, and sewed them in my tummy and said, you're going to go to the bathroom in a plastic bag the rest of your life. A month later, they went in and did that big one. I was on the table for 13.5 hours, took 27 units of blood. And they quit because I was dying. When I came out of the coma 4 days later, they went in to finish it, and that didn't work. I had that infection for 11 years. I had 27 major surgical procedures on my spine and abdomen. They did things to my body a person is not supposed to recover from. I got letters from some of the finest doctors in the world to the insurance company saying what Terry McBride has is not curable. He will be left with significant permanent disability. I'm going to be 70 years old this year. I don't have a bad back. I'm not recovering from a bad back. I haven't learned to live within my human limitations. And I took the prayer they gave me that said I needed to accept the things that I could not change and put it in the trash and put a new one up that said all things are possible if only I believe. Of course, if you do that, people will look you right in the eye and say, who do you think you are? But this morning isn't about how to use these principles to create health where there appears to be only disease. And you certainly can do that. This morning I want to talk to you about the mystical history of unity. And this is sort of a condensed version. What I want you to get is the depth and practicality of our teachings. The oldest living religion is the Hindu faith. When I first started studying the Hindu traditions, it seemed real confusing. They got a God for everything. But then I began to understand that the foundation for the Hindu teachings is everybody is different. And so what they have done in their teachings is make them available based on your priorities. If you're a farmer and your priority is growing crops, they got a God, a statue of a God, whose sole purpose is to help farmers grow crops. So that you can begin to relate to the divine power in the universe, if you will, based on your priorities, your aspirations. If you're a young woman and you're looking to maybe move into childbearing, and want to have some children, they got a God, well, a goddess, that is an aspect of the one God whose sole purpose is to help women get pregnant and be good mothers. They allow people to relate to the divine essence based on where they are. And as you move up in the traditions, you begin to understand that what they're getting at is what we come from. There's only one God, and there are many paths to become aware of your relationship to that divine presence. As you move up into the Hindu traditions, you begin to hear smatterings about the mystical teachings within Hinduism. But you couldn't go study those mystical teachings unless you were born of the right caste system. You couldn't study those mystical teachings unless you knew all the secret handshakes and all the doors to get in all that stuff. You couldn't go study it unless you were a man, of course. So they talked about these great mystical spiritual traditions, but only a very small group of people could go study them. But if you could study them, can you imagine what it must have felt like to be in a spiritual community that was about love and empowerment and exploring spiritual truths that said you can learn how to take charge of your mind? Because in the mystical teachings of Hinduism, it says this, and this is out of a book called The Magic and Mysticism of India. In the Hindu teachings, it is held that there exists a universal mental principle, which is known as creative mind. And the essence of this creative mind can be something like the blending or combination of personal will and imagination. And the Hindus hold that each individual is possessed with a portion of this creative mind. And they move on to say that this creative mind of the individual, when advanced enough, has the power of materializing physical creation directly itself without the need for physical labor. Pick up your bed and walk. Be ye cleansed. Feeding the masses, the miracles. That what the Hindu teachings hold is that each of us has a portion of this creative mind. Notice what we talked about today in the daily word. My mind is the mind, I have the mind of Christ. We quoted in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. It says, let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus. If you go study the mystical teachings, these ideas about who you are and what resources you have available have been around. It's just that only a select group could study them. And the Hindu teachings goes on and says that this creative mind can be used to demonstrate to yourself as you learn to make use of this God-like ability. That's the Hindu teachings. Next in this lineage, from my opinion, is the Jewish traditions. Started by Abraham or Abram, depending on how you want to pronounce it. He lived where there was all kinds of gods. And one day he woke up and said, nope, there's not all kinds of gods. There's only one God, monotheistic. One God that does everything. And out of his awakening, if you will, the 12 tribes of Israel and the Jewish traditions. As in most spiritual, my opinion, in most spiritual disciplines, in the beginning when they start, they're more focused on the rules. You know, so the books of Moses, the front end of Judaism has 613 rules. That if you're really going to get this right, here are the rules. You have to hold your palms up so you can be receptive. You have to feet on the floor so the energy from Mother Earth can flow through you. You have to open your ground chakra, raise your kundalini. And it's the same game that's played today. But once you get past the rules and how you're supposed to do this, all of a sudden what became to emerge was the mystical side of Judaism, which is usually held to be encapsulated in the Kabbalah. But again, you couldn't go study the teachings in the Kabbalah unless you could prove that you had Jewish heritage on both sides of your family for 5 generations. You had to jump through all the right hoops, and once again, you had to be male. So it was a very select group who could go study this. But if you could study it, what the Kabbalah is about is learning to use what they call kovana, mystical intention in prayer. But you could only use this mystical intention in prayer on your spiritual needs. Same kind of game that we have today. Yes, there's this power in the universe, but you can only use it if it's for the highest and doesn't go to everybody else. You can't. With the same game. And so the spiritual needs based on, I know this is kind of dry, but it gets to a really good point. Just hang in there. The mystical needs from the Jewish tradition was that they believed, like most of the great spiritual traditions, that we used to have our act together, we used to be one with God, and then when we came to earth, we fell from grace. That's how we language it in Christianity. What they talk about in Judaism is they say this chalice was broken. And so the whole purpose of this mystical teachings of Judaism is to heal that apparent separation between self and God. But then along comes a guy named Isaac Luria, who's credited as being one of the 3 most influentials in the teachers in the history of the Kabbalah. And this is what it says about Luria. It says, but Luria's doctrine of mystical intention in prayer went further than just this free outpouring of religious feeling. For Luria's doctrine stood directly on the borderline between traditional mysticism, healing this spiritual thing, and magic. Now when he uses the term magic, they're not talking sleight of hand. In the old days, when they talked about magic, that's when you used the power of your creative mind on your human needs and your human aspirations. That was magic. Healing the sick, raising the dead, water to wine, feeding the masses, that was magic. Now when he brought that to the party, that these spiritual principles aren't just about healing this, you know, so that when you die you go to heaven. You can use these spiritual principles so you can have heaven on earth. There was this big brouhaha. Same thing we got today. You read books and they say there's this power available, but you can only use it for this, you can only use it for this, you can only use it for this. You can't use this power for your own ego, self-aggrandizement. Which sounds great, unless, like me, when I was in the hospital for the 17th surgery, they sent me to see a psychiatrist who read my medical records and said, you're never going to get well. If you come work with me, I can assist you to face the reality of living in a wheelchair with dignity. And I said, I don't want to believe like you. I'm reading these books, and these books say there's a part of me that's not sick. These books say there's a part of me that's not afraid. And what these books say is if I can really own that's who I am, if I get in touch with that part of me that's not sick and not afraid, what these books say is from there I can create reality rather than face reality. And he looked at me and he said, Terry, that's your ego talking. This need of you to be healthy and well is ego-driven. You think you won't be a whole man if you can't stand on your own 2 feet. I looked him right in the eye and said, you're right, and got up and walked out of his office. And as I opened the door, he said, Terry, and I looked back one last time and said, what? And he said, son, you are in denial. Have you ever noticed you're only in denial when you disagree with them? They're never in denial when they disagree with you. Have you ever noticed it's always your ego talking and never their ego talking? It's challenging today to step up and own your divine authority because we got so many teachers who want to tell you you're not holy now. It can be difficult, and when Luria brought to the mystical side of Judaism that you could use these spiritual principles, this mystical intention in prayer to make your dreams come true, they belittled it. But that idea persisted. Then it said in the mystical writings about 3,500, 4,000 years ago, all of a sudden came what is sometimes called the ancient mystery schools. The Essenes in the Middle East, the Druids in the United Kingdom area, the School of Isis for women in Egypt, the Magi in Persia. And these different mystery schools, if you will, was the movement of this need to teach these principles other than just this select group here or this select group here. It opened up. But still, you couldn't get into the mystery schools unless you had these rules. You know, you had to... And it said that the teachers, the heads of all of these different religions, these different mystery schools, were in truth understanding that they were all teaching the same stuff. And so about 3,000 years ago, it is said in the writings, or 2,500, depending, a call went out to an ascended master who was willing to come again and take these teachings to the world. And in mystical writings, the culmination of that request was the birth of Jesus. And in the original Greek writings of the New Testament, the guys that come to visit Jesus at his birth are not called the three wise men. In the original Greek, they're called the masters of Magi. And the symbology of that were these three masters coming from three different directions to acknowledge this is the person who will take these teachings to the world. That's the mystical history of Christianity, the mystical history of unity. I'm not saying that's the way it is. I'm not saying Jesus wasn't the only begotten Son of the living God. I'm not saying he wasn't a virgin born. I'm not doing any of that. I'm not playing with the dogma of Christianity. I'm talking about the mystical history. And what Charles talks about, Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, talks about is that it's time we step up and own who we are. It's time we step up and begin to relate to this thing that the Hindus call our God-like ability. Because in the 13th century, there was a renowned Hebrew scholar named Moses ben Maimon. Now, he's a Hebrew scholar. And he wrote a book called A Guide for the Perplexed. Sounds like a book we could use today. And in there, notice he's a Hebrew scholar. He's not a Jewish scholar of the dogma. He's a scholar of the language. And he opens his book with, he goes on to explain that the phrase, "Let us make man in our image," signifies not a physical likeness, but an intellectual likeness. I have the mind of Christ. Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus. Throughout our teachings, there is this reference to an aspect of what I'm calling your creative mind, that when you take charge of it, when you learn to take charge of your creative mind, you can begin to use this godlike ability and demonstrate on the planet. Charles Fillmore on page 71 of Unity Treasure Chest is talking, all right, so how do you do this? So here is this mystical history that you and I are not our stuff. We're not our history. We're not the adult child of an alcoholic parent or the product of a dysfunctional family or the small self and saboteur that's always trying to lead us astray or the ego's always trying to separate you from God or any of that other stuff they have told you that's not true. You're God expressing uniquely as you, and you may have limiting beliefs. You're the living embodiment of God Almighty. That makes you the living Christ, and you may have limiting habit patterns, but you're not your stuff. So how do you begin? Where do you start? Charles says the way to do it is the way Jesus did it. He acknowledged himself to be the Son of God. The attainment of Christ consciousness calls for nothing less on our part than a definite recognition of ourselves as the sons and daughters of God, right here, right now, regardless of appearances to the contrary. That's the truth that sets you free. You're not your stuff, and not only are you not your stuff, you're the physical embodiment of Spirit itself. And when you know that truth, it sets you free. And what does it set you free from? The lie of human limitations. And the challenge is that you and I grew up with a lot of teachers who did not believe themselves to be of Christ. So they always tell you you've got more to do. You need to let go enough, willing enough, be hope open enough, forgive enough. There's always this list. And what Jesus said is you're holy now. The way to do this is the way Jesus did it. He acknowledged himself to be the Son of God. The truth that sets you free. And then he goes on and says, so now what do you do? All right, so I'm a spiritual being, having a human experience. Now what do I do? On page 98 he says this. Jesus did not claim to have exclusive use of the supernatural power he used. He knew that others could do what he did if they would only try. And he encouraged his followers to use the power of faith and the power of thought. The works that I do shall ye do also, and even greater works than these shall ye do. What you have created here is a spiritual community whose total focus is you understanding the truth about who you are and applying them in your life. And you apply them to make your dreams come true. And when you make your dreams come true, what you'll get is an experience of who you are that's even bigger than your dreams. And I know it can be confusing when you start. I know it can be confusing when you're surrounded by dis-ease and people who are telling you to face reality, don't try to be too much, or you need to accept the things that you cannot change. It can be challenging, but here, you have a family whose total purpose is to assist you to know the truth and step into it. Where else are you going to explore this? You think at Christmas with your extended family you could sit at the dinner table and right after everybody eats say, you know what I got last Sunday at church? I'm the living Christ. Exactly. This center is an answer to your prayer.
This center is an answer to the prayer of humanity. Since the beginning of time, where can I go to find the truth that I'm free? Where can I go to learn how to get involved here? And I think it's more than just showing up at church on Sunday, and showing up at church on Sunday is wonderful. You want to learn how to pray? Get in the chaplain's program. Every chaplain I've ever talked to said I was nervous about it, but I got in it. I was with my peer group. They had this little study thing. But as I moved along, I began to understand not only how to pray for others, I learned how to pray for myself. You're fairly new here, and sometimes you look around and everybody's loving everybody and it looks like they know everybody, and you feel kind of maybe. Then be a greeter. All you got to do is come in for a week or two, and when you come in there and get to love on people, you'll find they already think you're family. You love doing food, get involved in the hospitality program. You love doing gardening, get involved in the beautification. There's so much for you to get involved with based on your hearts. And what will happen is you begin to understand you're not alone. And it's not just the non-physical power that's here supporting, empowering you. It's your sisters and brothers. It can be challenging to move out into the universe and say, I'm not my stuff. I'm the physical embodiment of God. I have the mind of Christ. All things are possible if only I believe. But if you stick with it, and when you're afraid, reach out. Ask somebody to hear and hold your hand. What I want to tell you, you can overcome anything and create what you want. You can spread your wings and fly over the storms of life. It can be challenging. But you're not alone. What an honor it is for me I prayed so many nights that I could have a community like yours. Someplace that would support me. It's an honor for me to stand in your presence.